Alan Jackson is playing his final concert in Nashville this week. One of the last men standing from what the industry called the Class of '89. And to understand why that matters, you need to understand Music Row. Every song that ever made you pull over just to hear it out. Every ballad that hit harder than it had any right to. Every anthem that sounded like home even if you'd never been there. All of it came out of the same 3-block stretch of Nashville, Tennessee. Music Row is the most powerful factory in American music history. For 50 years, it manufactured superstars on an assembly line that almost nobody outside of Nashville ever saw. This is how it worked. In 1955, a session guitarist named Owen Bradley converted an Army surplus quonset hut at 804 16th Avenue South into a recording studio. Corrugated metal walls, concrete floor, a control booth the size of a large closet. Bradley and his brother Harold began recording Patsy Cline, Brenda Lee, Conway Twitty, and Webb Pierce inside it. And something happened that nobody had fully planned for. The sound coming out of that hut was different. Cleaner than what Hollywood was producing. More polished than anything out of New York. Commercially usable in a way that existing country recordings simply weren't. Word got out fast. RCA moved in across the street. Chet Atkins, guitarist, producer, and probably the single most important person in the commercial history of country music, became head of RCA Nashville and built his own studio 2 blocks north. Columbia followed. Monument Records, Decca. By 1960, the major labels had established a physical colony in a 2-block radius in the middle of Nashville, and every serious country act in America had to come through it. That wasn't an accident, that was the plan. Because what Bradley and Atkins were building wasn't just a recording hub. They were building a deliberately engineered commercial product. They called it the Nashville Sound, and its founding principle was direct. Country music needed to stop sounding like country music. Atkins was explicit about it. He wanted to make country acceptable to people who didn't like country. So they stripped out the steel guitar. They removed the fiddle, the defining instrument of the genre for 30 years. They brought in string sections and professional background vocalists, the Jordanaires and the Anita Kerr singers, to smooth everything out. They transformed a rough-edged regional folk form into something that could sit comfortably on pop radio next to Frank Sinatra and not sound out of place. Billy Sherrill, who came up through this same system a decade later as a producer at Columbia, pushed the Nashville sound even further. His Countrypolitan productions for Tammy Wynette and George Jones in the late 60s and 70s represented the full maturation of what Bradley and Atkins had started. The factory had produced its own second generation of architects. It worked beyond anyone's expectations, and it set the template for every era that followed. To understand how Music Row really operated, though, you have to understand that a country music career in Nashville was never fundamentally about talent. It was about surviving a system. Here's how the assembly line worked. A songwriter arrived in Nashville, usually broke, usually from somewhere rural, usually clutching a notebook full of songs written on a pickup truck dashboard or a back porch. The first stop was not a record label. It was a publisher. Publishing houses lined both sides of 16th and 17th Avenue. Acuff Rose, founded by Roy Acuff and Fred Rose, was the first major publishing company built specifically around country music. Others included Tree International and Combine Music. They functioned as the gatekeepers at the front of the factory floor. A writer signed with a publisher handed over the copyright to their songs in exchange for a weekly draw against future royalties and spent their days writing material to order. If the publisher liked something, they'd cut a demo. Professional demo singers, many of them extraordinary vocalists who never became famous themselves, would track the song in one of the small studios further down the row. The publisher then walked that tape across the street to an AR man at a label. The AR man, artist and repertoire, the person who decided what actually got recorded, listened to 50 demos a week. If he liked something, he matched it to an artist on the roster. The artist did not write it. In many cases, they'd never heard it before they walked into the studio. That was standard. That was the process. Then came the recording session, and this is where the machine was most visible. Because the musicians who played on virtually every country record made in Nashville between 1955 and 1985 were the same small group of men. They were called the A-Team. Harold Bradley on guitar, Bob Moore on bass, Buddy Harman on drums, Floyd Kramer on piano, Hank Garland on guitar. A handful of others rotated in and out. These men played on thousands of records, including Patsy Cline, Elvis Presley, Roy Orbison, Dolly Parton, Don Williams. Their names never appeared on the album covers. That was entirely deliberate. The stars got the credit. The machine produced the sound. A session ran 3 hours. In that time, the A-Team was expected to deliver 4 finished master recordings. They didn't rehearse. They read chord charts written in the Nashville number system, a shorthand notation that let them transpose instantly into any key, and produced radio-ready tracks faster than anyone watching from the outside could believe. The label then handled distribution and radio promotion, and this is where the machine's grip became absolute. Country radio in America was not a meritocracy. Tracks reached the airwaves because labels paid to put them there. Promotion men traveled from station to station. Money changed hands. A song without a Nashville label's promotion infrastructure behind it simply didn't exist as far as country radio was concerned. It couldn't be heard if the machine didn't choose to amplify it. So if you wanted a career in country music between 1960 and 2000, here's what your path looked like. You came to Nashville. You signed with a Nashville publisher. You recorded in a Nashville studio with Nashville session players, produced by a Nashville producer. You got promoted by a Nashville label through a Nashville radio promotion network. Every link in that chain lived on 3 blocks of one city in Tennessee. That was the factory. And it was extraordinarily efficient at one thing in particular, manufacturing the careers it wanted to manufacture. But here is what efficient factories always do to the things that don't fit their process. They reject them. Willie Nelson arrived in Nashville in 1960 as a songwriter. He was already one of the most gifted writers Music Row had encountered. Patsy Cline cut his Crazy, Billy Walker cut Funny How Time Slips Away, and Farron Young cut Hello Walls. Willie Nelson was making other people famous on a scale the Row loved. But when it came to his own recording career, the machine did not know what to do with him. His voice was too nasal. His phrasing landed in the wrong places rhythmically. His instincts were too far outside what the Nashville sound required. So they dressed him in suits. They put string arrangements behind him. They tried to process him into the product the factory knew how to sell. Those records sold almost nothing because they had systematically removed the exact things that made Willie Nelson worth hearing. In 1971, he quit Nashville entirely. He moved to Austin, Texas. He grew his hair out. He played with a different band in a different way. When Red-Headed Stranger came out in 1975, Columbia Nashville did not want to release it. It was too sparse, too unproduced, and too far outside the factory spec. They released it anyway under pressure, and it sold over 1 million copies. Waylon Jennings had the same fight for the better part of a decade, battling RCA Nashville for the right to record his own way, with his own band, without the A-Team and the standard formula. When the label finally relented, the album Wanted the Outlaws became the first country record to go platinum. Dwight Yoakam could not get a deal in Nashville in the early 1980s because he sounded too traditional, too honky-tonk, too much like the genre the Row had deliberately modernized away from. He went to Los Angeles instead, signed with Reprise Records, and debuted with Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., an album that eventually went platinum 3 times. The machine rejected him. The audience found him anyway. This pattern runs consistently across 5 decades of country music history. The Music Row formula was powerful enough to manufacture superstars from scratch, and rigid enough to miss them when they arrived already formed. By the late 1980s, though, the Row had learned to absorb even its own rebellions. The urban cowboy era had inflated country music commercially and then collapsed it. When the debris settled, the labels looked hard at what the audience actually wanted and made a deliberate decision: go back to traditional. What followed was the most calculated act of star manufacturing in the genre's history. In 1989, 3 unknown acts released debut singles within months of each other: Clint Black on RCA, Garth Brooks on Capitol, Alan Jackson on Arista. They had been signed, developed, positioned, and released by Music Row with a level of intentionality the industry had not managed at this scale before. Jimmy Bowen at Capitol Nashville, Tony Brown at MCA, Tim DuBois at Arista. The label heads of that era operated less like music executives and more like architects. They were not discovering talent, they were constructing careers. Then the system scaled in a way that surprised even the people running it. By 1993, country music accounted for nearly 1 in 5 album sales in America. Sit with that number. One genre in one decade, capturing a market share that neither pop nor rock had achieved in their respective peaks. And we know those numbers with precision because of SoundScan, the point-of-sale tracking system introduced in 1991 that replaced industry estimates with actual sales data. SoundScan didn't create country's dominance. It just made it impossible to ignore. Garth Brooks outsold the Beatles by catalog volume over this period. Shania Twain's Come On Over became the best-selling album ever released by a female solo artist. Billy Ray Cyrus had a #1 debut that sold over 9 million copies in the United States alone. Music Row expanded physically to match the commercial reality. 16th and 17th Avenue grew into a full industry district, including management firms, booking agencies, publishing houses, studios, radio promotion companies, merchandise operations, and tour logistics. The 3 blocks Owen Bradley started with in 1955 became 30 blocks of a vertically integrated entertainment machine. At its peak, Music Row didn't just make country music, it made country music the dominant commercial force in American popular entertainment. The Country Music Hall of Fame, which sits at the edge of this district, exists in part as a monument to what those 30 blocks produced, a physical archive of the factory's output. Then streaming arrived. The system that had been powerful enough to build a billion-dollar industry was also brittle in one very specific way. It was built entirely around gatekeepers. Every stage of the Music Row assembly line depended on a small group of people controlling access. The publisher decided whose songs got demoed, the A&R man decided what got recorded, the promotion man decided what went to radio. Remove the gatekeepers, and the architecture doesn't gradually weaken, it collapses. When Spotify and Apple Music made distribution essentially free, when any artist could put a recording in front of 30 million listeners without a Nashville label's infrastructure, the fundamental logic of Music Row stopped working. The thing that had made those 3 blocks indispensable for 50 years was no longer indispensable. Texas and Red Dirt Country emerged as a fully independent ecosystem that simply operated as though Music Row didn't exist. The Turnpike Troubadours built a touring business that rivaled major label acts without ever signing in Nashville. Tyler Childers won a Grammy with music the Row hadn't touched. Zach Bryan accumulated billions of streams before the Nashville industry had properly cataloged who he was or what lane he belonged in. These weren't outlaws fighting the system the way Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings had fought it. They were artists who had grown up in a world where the system was optional, and they'd simply chosen not to use it. Music Row is still there, the buildings are still there, some of the labels are still there, but the machine, the closed loop of publishers, team players, A&R men, and radio promotion that constituted the assembly line, that's gone. The factory closed somewhere between 2005 and 2015, and most people didn't notice because the buildings were still standing. Alan Jackson is playing his final concert in Nashville this week, one of the last men standing from the class of '89. One of the voices that defined what Music Row's product was supposed to sound like at the height of its commercial power, playing his last show at Nissan Stadium, a football stadium, because that's what Music Row made country music before it started to come apart. Owen Bradley built the Quonset hut in 1955. The factory ran for 50 years. It manufactured Patsy Cline and Elvis and Dolly Parton and Willie Nelson and Garth Brooks and Shania Twain and Alan Jackson. It took one genre in one city on 3 blocks of Nashville, Tennessee, and made it the most commercially dominant force in American music history. And it worked. For 50 years it worked, precisely because almost nobody outside of those 3 blocks ever knew how it actually worked. Now you do.